Hello and welcome to the EvilTester Show, a podcast on software testing, and this is a Black Friday special because I'm recording it on Black Friday, so expect us to cover oracles, bargains, expert opinions, and confidence. Hello, welcome to the show. My name is Alan Richardson. I'm your host for the EvilTester Show. You can find us at eviltester.com and the show notes are at eviltester.com/show. So this is Black Friday. I've played my Tester's Black Friday game. The Tester Black Friday game is basically, before Black Friday starts, you have to try and identify sites that you think are going to fail under Black Friday load. Now this has been getting harder and harder every year because sites are expecting this now. In the UK, websites used to just crumble because we didn't have Black Friday. The demand was unexpected. Boom. Now sites are holding up pretty well. Some of them can be a bit slow. I noticed a couple of sites were slow this morning, but I didn't see any that I had predicted were going to actually fall. However, when we're playing the game as testers, just because a site renders doesn't actually mean that the site is functioning. So we have to browse, we have to check the search, and ideally we want to go through and put something in the basket and try and check out, because all these processes chained can fail under load. It's not just the rendering might be coming through a cache, the images might be off a CDN, the load might be distributed across different machines. The baskets are more likely to be centralized because it's harder to sync across different machines, and the checkout process is very often on a single machine because it's also very often outsourced to someone else. I noticed this when I was trying to buy one of those SNES minis, the Nintendo SNES Mini Classics. The demand for those was massive and it was just pulling websites down all the time. So I had to actually use a mobile app to complete my checkout process rather than the website. Simply because the way the system was architected. So Black Friday is an interesting day, particularly if you work in retail and you've had to performance test the site and see if it actually holds up. But just as a tester, as a consumer, seeing whether websites are robust in the face of failure. But what I also find interesting is, as an extension to that game, not just can we do the checkout process, but what's interesting is who is observing whom. Because some sites price match other sites. And if you find a Black Friday deal on one site, can you identify another site that is monitoring that site to see if they're automatically price matching? That can be a really good arbitrage opportunity as a consumer, and because some sites offer better guarantees than others. But it's a useful extension in terms of how are sites observing each other, because it's one of the testing principles that we have to figure out for ourselves. How can we observe the system and how can we automatically track the observations we're making? Other interesting thing I find from a testing perspective is when we see a deal online, there's a human factor, right? The human factor is it's a deal. Amazon are great. They've got this countdown timer that really stresses this is a deal. We really have to hurry. There's an urgency in terms of the communication process at this point. And because there's an urgency, we might not compare. We might not find another oracle to check against. We might not see if this is actually a deal or whether it's cheaper on another site. And how do we know how to check? How do we know the source of the oracles? Because we're testing a website, we need an external source that tells us this is a good deal or not. If I'm working on Amazon, there's a great site called Camel, where you put in the URL for the product and it tries to maintain a history of prices over time. I was looking at one thing in the Black Friday deal on Amazon. It was a set of headphones. It was selling for £15 and it said it was sailed down from £50. I thought that's a bit dodgy. So I had a look on Camel, and previously it had been selling for £9. But in the week before the sale, it went up to £49 and now had dropped down to 15. And what's interesting is, as people, we very often rely on the laws, the rules, the requirements of sites to help us make decisions, particularly in high pressure situations. And in the UK Sale of Goods Act, to claim that products are on sale, you should show the previous price, which Amazon did. It said it was £50 or whatever, but it should also have been selling at that price for a meaningful period of time. I'm not convinced that, given that it had been selling at £9 for 2 years, to then jump up to £49 a week before is a meaningful period of time. So very often we rely on rules and regulations or requirements to help us make decisions. And as testers, That can be dangerous because we have to check that those requirements are actually working before we base opinions on them. Now, if rules and laws are not being enforced, they're not being tested, they're not being checked beforehand, we cannot trust them. Which is why Black Friday it's a useful day to exercise your testing skills and critical thinking skills, to look for oracles, to find out whether things are working, to try and identify how you know whether this is a deal, and to not rush to a time-based conclusion and look for evidence and not trust. And trust brings me on to the notion of expert opinions. Because as ever, every week, I use Twitter and I look for opinions and what's going on. And I'll see things and I'll go, I'm not sure about that. So what is an expert, right? We see people talking on Twitter. Some of them are experts in the sense that their voice is likely to be heard more than others. And also people are more likely to respond to it. And very often what happens is an expert says something, then it gets a lot of expert backing. So people on social media like it or comment and go, yes, they link off to their articles on the same topic, thereby giving it more weight and more evidence. And it all seems like, wow, this is a real thing. I should take note of this because these are experts discussing this. Now, hopefully, as testers, we apply some critical thinking to that and possibly some humor. One of the things over this week, there were expert opinions around automating. There's always expert opinions around automating. In this case, it was automating, particularly automating through the GUI. And automating through the GUI is hard, right? Make no mistake. And there's a lot of skill sets involved and you have to architect the system to allow you to automate there better. But the problem with automating through the GUI is not that you are automating through the GUI. If you view that as the problem, the fact that you're automating through the GUI, then your only solution is to not automate through the GUI. And that was some of the messages that were coming through as expert opinions. So the opinions were phrased as, stop automating through the GUI. Yes, I agree. Stop automating through the GUI. Here's something I wrote on stop. Yes, this is fantastic. We should never automate through the GUI. Yes, this is what we're saying. I think there are perfectly good reasons for automating through the GUI. However, I assume that these experts have a sense of humor, and I decided to take this notion as being a provocation, a devil's advocate approach. Now, one of the interesting things is expert opinions are very often stated with confidence, and that's one of the skills. If you're not yet an expert and you want to be an expert, state things with confidence. It's the easiest way to be treated as an expert. Let's assume for a second that they were devil's advocate. They didn't quite mean it. They meant it, but they wanted you to think about it. They were pushing some buttons. So if you stopped automating through the GUI, you would have to find another way to automate, assuming you still wanted to automate. That's a useful exercise that you should do anyway. Right? If your default for automating is automating through the GUI, if your only approach for automating is automating through the GUI, you probably have a limited set of options, and that might be a problem. So then the statement of stop automating through the GUI might be useful to you, because you might have to stop and think, how else can I automate this? So then you start thinking, well, I'll automate through the API. You might not have an API. Under those circumstances, I have treated the application as an API. And by that, I mean, I have looked at the traffic going from the web front end to the back end, bypassed the GUI, and created a wrapper around that traffic. So if you submit a form, I would, rather than automate the GUI filling out the form and submitting it, I would just send the HTTP message that the form would normally send. So I'm automating the messages. So I'm essentially stubbing out the actual GUI, or mocking the GUI, whichever word you prefer. And I sometimes use that as a tactic in order to make the automated execution work faster. But there's a risk when I do that. Remember that every change we make to our approach has a risk, or may have risks, may introduce risk in our process. By not automating through the GUI, what happens? We may not be testing the JavaScript functionality across browser. How do we mitigate that risk? We might choose to mitigate that risk by introducing unit tests that run in the browser. So we're actually executing the JavaScripts across the browser, but we might not be testing the JavaScript interaction with the DOM. How do we mitigate that risk? Well, we might create a playground GUI that allows the JavaScript slightly more than unit tests to actually integrate with a GUI. We might choose different ways of mitigating that risk. And we might not automate through GUI tools, but we might still automate in a browser and still have things rendering. There's different options around this. So the notion that you stop might be useful to you to think about new options, because that's one of the things we want to do. With Black Friday, deals come up. Is this the best option? Look for other options. Keep other options in mind. Look for different ways of doing things, different ways of checking your results. It's a useful thing. Automating at different points in the application mitigates different risks. If you stop automating at the GUI, there's probably a class of risks that you're no longer mitigating. So bear that in mind if you choose to take this expert advice. And also you might find that one of your problems is that your application simply hasn't been architected or built in a way that allows you to mitigate a lot of risks by not automating at the GUI. Like, you might have an application that does everything through JavaScript, and the JavaScript only works in the front end when it's running on live, with graphics coming in from the CDN, with proper data coming in from the test environment. You might have architected something that is really hard to test in isolation in small chunks and to automate in any other way. And if that's the case, that's your problem. Your problem is not the fact that you are automating through the GUI. The problem is that you have no other option but to automate through the GUI, and that if you stop automating and testing there, you're not mitigating or testing for an entire huge class of risks. So expert opinions, I think, are useful when they're stated strongly and confidently, if they get you to think about what you are doing. I think they are bad if you then think, I must do this for the expert has said this, in the same way that this is on sale, therefore I must buy this because clearly this is the best price to buy at. Then you might discover that you've bought a pair of headphones that you think were £50 for £15, when really you can buy them tomorrow for £9. Now, a lot of the podcasts are probably going to be triggered by expert opinions that I see on Twitter. Another one that came through recently was about confidence, and to paraphrase the things that I saw, because there was a bunch of people tweeting different things. It was, testing is there to boost the confidence in the business that the software works and can go live, which to me is, confidence isn't the best word. I've read too many Jim Thompson novels about con men to treat confidence as a thing that means truth and goodness. So confidence goes both ways. Confidence, I have confidence that this works. I have confidence that this does not work. One of them has evidence. Look, I'm switching this on. It does not work. I put this data in. It throws this exception. I'm doing this thing and it does not work. One has probability and belief. We may not have the evidence, or we may not have enough evidence to convince everyone because we haven't seen that it fails. So the fact that it's doing what we think it's supposed to do suggests that it works, and there's a probability that it works. We haven't demonstrated that it doesn't work. So the more that we don't demonstrate that it doesn't work, we increase our confidence that it works if our minds is working in that way. My mind doesn't work in that way. My mind works in the way of, I'm continuing to do this and it's continuing to work. I have not yet found the point at which this fails. And my confidence in the system isn't building, but my confidence in my ability to find the problem is failing. And I start to lose confidence in my testing rather than gain confidence in the system. And very often I gain confidence in a path through the system simply because I know that I'm concerned that if I deviate off that path, it's going to fail. So I'm very careful in the real world to do things slowly, to not try and stress the system, because I don't believe it's going to work outside these very common, simple paths. So confidence, I think, works in different ways. And the notion that confidence is only a good thing is something that we have to knock out of our heads as testers. The interpretation of test results might boost confidence, but that depends on the person communicating. That's why we have confidence men. They communicate in a way that builds confidence. That's why we have salesmen. They communicate in a way that builds confidence. Now, it doesn't have to be gender specific. I'm just using those words because I'm old and that's what I'm used to, and those are the books that I read. I don't think that the communication that leads confidence is a guarantee in its veracity, and I don't think that's an aim of testing. I don't think the communication of testing should be to increase confidence. Sometimes the very aim of communicating testing is to decrease confidence, and we call that bug advocacy. We found a problem, we advocate for it, we're increasing someone's confidence that something is wrong. That's what we're attempting to do, because very often confidence is built on beliefs. I am going to recommend a book. The book that I'm going to recommend is called The Big Con by David Maurer. I think this was written in the 40s, but I don't think it got properly published until the 90s. So this is 1999 edition. And this is a book that just goes through lots of stories about con artists. I also recommend any Jim Thompson novel pretty much, or read a couple and you'll find some books about con men, because con tricks are very important. What's interesting is that a lot of the sales techniques that we see on Black Friday are found in con tricks. There's a perceived value. If you're going to get conned, there's a perceived massive value very often in the payout of the con, which is why you get involved. In a Black Friday, there's a perceived value in the discount. In testing, there's a perceived value in the work that we're doing and the communication that we're giving, but it might not be there. It's a perceived value, so we have to be careful how we communicate. There's an urgency in a con trick. There's urgency in the con man. If he's doing a 3-card Monty on a street corner, he wants to get your money before the police come along. There's an urgency that you can't string someone along forever because their critical thinking process kicks in and they start to doubt. They get exposed to oracles that might hint at something being wrong. So at confidence, there is a thing called a long con, which is a very carefully built up approach to building confidence and layering things on top to provide the evidence that a longer thought process requires. But short con is really about urgency rather than long term, and about perceived value, massive perceived value. Now, a con man is generally an expert in communication and tailors their message for the mark. So there's a lot of flexibility in how they communicate to get that message across effectively to the person who's listening, which is why I don't particularly like standardized test reports, because they're not built to communicate a message to the specific people. Bug advocacy is different. Bug advocacy is where you tailor your message to convince someone that there's a problem. It's very much relying back to that effective communication thing. Lessons learned from con men. I mentioned experts earlier on. Experts very often talk in terms of confidence. They assert their statement very strongly, which is why it comes across and we believe it. But we also have to be careful because con men rely on that. And even experts are taken in by con men. Scientists are taken in by magicians posing as fake psychics because of the confidence in their approach and because the magician knows the science process, so knows how to bypass some of the experimental constraints, knows how to get around the tests that the scientists have put in place. But we've got the scientist then has evidence that they're using, so we have to be very careful about the tests that we apply. If we are going to use the confidence word, the tests that we use and the oracles that we use and the observations that we make are vitally important. Really want to stress this on Black Friday simply because that's what Black Friday relies on. It relies on us not doing the experiments, not checking to see if this has been at a different price, not looking around at different oracles to see if this is working, being taken in by the sense of urgency, knowing that the site is an expert in selling it and we have built up trust in it and we trust it, and there are laws that will protect us, like the Sale of Goods Act, where if it's said it's a sale, it must be a sale because it's been on. We have to trust the evidence that we're seeing and the results of our experiments, and do experiments that give us the information that we want and need as testers, because you can be confident that something is false. Very often your confidence that something is true is built on beliefs rather than evidence. And if it is built on evidence, have you tested the evidence enough? That is what I want us to take as the testing lessons learned from confidence men, con men, and Black Friday. So I hope that helps. Remember, if you're listening to this in video on YouTube, subscribe so that you keep up to date with all our videos. And if you're listening to this on audio, thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope you've subscribed through iTunes or whatever other podcast software you use.